Hello to all my channel viewers. In this podcast style episode, Bea and I discuss the Venus archetype via all the symbolism that is revealed through its mythology as well as the astrological connections. And if you want to hear the Mars episode, the one that's next after this one, you can already find it on our podcast site via the web link or any podcast app using your phone. Also, I'll mention that at the podcast location, all the episodes are currently running ad-free all the way through. Thank you and enjoy.
Welcome to Archetypes and the Planets, where Andre Kahr and I, Bea Gonzalez, invite you to think metaphorically as we explore how we have collectively translated the map of the sky into our mythologies, religious systems, and personal psychology. Okay, so today we are looking at Venus. And the first thing to say about Venus that has always struck me as so interesting is that just and the ancients were aware of this, which is why I think all the mythologies reflect it, is what a beautiful, how it beautifully traces a pentagram in the sky as it does its 8-year synodic cycle. So the cycle is where it comes back. Every 8 years, it comes back to exactly the same space, right? And as it does that, and I'm going to, in the show notes, link this so people can see this visually, because they will see that it creates a rose kind of image. And that's what you see in things like the Gothic cathedrals, right? You see the representation of beauty. So the fact that Venus is associated with beauty is already inscribed in the very path she is tracing in the sky, which is so cool. And by the way, the Maya, a lot of our ancient cultures understood this. They tracked it. Venus was important. Why? Because she's so bright, right, in the sky. And so they had this special veneration for Venus. But a lot of people, when they look at mythology, they look only at Aphrodite, which is the Greek expression. But prior to the Greeks, remember that the astrology, because it's astronomy fundamentally at the beginning, there's a long tradition of this. So the first incarnation of Venus is very interesting to me because it's Inanna, right? Ishtar and then Inanna. And what's really interesting about that is that these two have a story. They're meshed. I mean, they have basically the same story. Inanna is the Mesopotamian myth earlier, and then Ishtar becomes the Sumerian myth. And both of them deal with descent. And we've talked about this before. When you look at planets or the lights, you want to look at the opposite, right? There's a polarity involved. So what's interesting about Venus is that in both her rulerships, she rules Taurus and Libra. The opposite is Scorpio, which is Mars in the traditional rulerships, and in the other one it is Scorpio, and it is Aries, which is Mars as well. So Mars is involved in each of them. So the polarity is always this masculine energy called Mars. And the reason this is really interesting to me is that in the original myth, Inanna descends. She has to make this descent to visit her sister Ereshkigal's domain. And she does it, it's such a rich myth. She does it by stripping off every piece of clothing, 7 pieces, because of course it's 7 planets. And it's only when you strip down and you become vulnerable that you can make the descent into the underworld. And the underworld is where her sister is. She's gone down because her sister's in mourning because she lost her husband. Once she's there, this is going to sound familiar, she's hung upside down for 3 days and 3 nights dead. And then she's eventually rescued and brought back up. So that's the idea that the underworld journey takes you down into the depths. You really are sacrificed. Some part of you has to be sacrificed, right? So this happens, and we're going to talk a lot about values and what they mean with Venus, but it happens every time you have to sacrifice a part of what yourself, a part of what you're thinking to change it. You're kind of like, if you think about it, it's a beautiful, not beautiful, it's kind of shocking, but it's a good representation of how you feel. You feel like that. You're in a space where nothing moves, and when you're dead, okay? What's interesting to me is that seems very Scorpionic, which is Mars rulership on the opposite side. So it's like you're invoking the other side because you can't have one without the other. So that's one of the myths that really speaks to me, and that's the earlier incarnation of Venus. The other thing that's really interesting, and this is from an astronomy viewpoint, which is so fascinating about Venus, the ancients didn't know that they thought it was 2 different stars or planets at the beginning, right? Because Venus is very bright, and so they would see it. But the reason they thought that is one day every 5 years or so, and the next time it's going to happen in the Northern Hemisphere, I think is March 18th, 2025, you can see Venus in certain places, both as a morning star and as an evening star. And so someone, Michelle Covissier, who from Belgium, she did this great talk where she said, that's why Venus can conquer, that's why love can conquer death, because Venus is associated with love. Because one day a year in that cycle, she basically does not go into the underworld. She's able to survive death. And so the idea is, well, in all our religious traditions, what survives death? Love, right? Because that exists beyond death. And I thought that was such an interesting observation about how it's behaving in the sky. But the thing is, of course, eventually they realize this is the same planet. It's very bright. And the other thing is Venus can't get very far away from the sun. It can't get beyond 47 degrees. Once it's that far, it starts turning back towards the sun. So it's like a servant to the sun. You can almost see it as the thing that translates the sun's path, the solar path, in a beautiful way. That Venusian way where you say, okay, I'm serving you. I'm going to do everything to make whatever the expression of your solar journey more beautiful and clearer, and bring discernment to that. Now, finally, I would say that you can't forget the Greek version of it. So you have Inanna, you have Ishtar, and then you get to the Greeks. And the Greeks reformulate Venus Aphrodite. And Venus Aphrodite is really interesting because she comes from Zeus's head. She's born basically from his head, fully armed. She comes out of his head. And if you think about it, or Venus Athena, sorry, it's Athena that comes out of his head. When she comes out of his head as a fully armed thing, she has a very masculine quality. And I don't know about you, but I see the Venus in Taurus as vastly different from the Venus in Libra. And when I think of this fully armed warrior, I think of the Venus in Libra because that's a masculine yang sign. So you have more of the association with this more. And of course, Athena is associated with Athens, which is where you have this wonderful architectural. And I always think of Libra, the Venus in Libra, more to do with architecture and art. I think the Venus in Taurus is more about earthiness and much more connected to the earth. So how do you see all this? I'm just blithering on, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah, well, a few things that triggered some thoughts. Yes, the polarity, 100%. You always get information by considering the opposite sign, the opposite planet. And it's curious that I can't think of the name now, but an astrologer that's done some really good work on Venus and the Venus cycles, because you described it makes a pentagram in the sky over a number of years, and it has, I think it's 8-year cycle, something like that.
8-year cycle, yeah, it's an 8-year cycle.
Right. Yes. So, but he identified Venus as consensus, like a society, in a way. They're linking Venus to Saturn in a way where everybody agrees, okay, this is what we like, this is what we're going to do. And then you can get, in retrograde Venus cycles, you can get rebellions against consensus because the planet goes the other way. And that's exactly what happened, almost coincident with the George Floyd situation.
Yes, that's true.
And you had all this unrest and, literal rebellion. So that's one example of a way Venus is functioning that you might not suspect. But more in line now with what you were mentioning around the myth, the one thing that has always stuck in my mind is Venus as both being associated with beauty and the connection to Libra, the warriorship. I would agree. Athena, Pallas Athena, in fact, is a warrioress, symbol. So that makes a lot of sense. In fact, I think I have this feeling that Eris may be connected to Libra as well as a female energy, but driven to take action, which is a cardinal sign. All that stuff. But then. The other thing would be that in the beauty side, one thing that really stuck with me over the years is that the sun shines light on Venus. When you see Venus in the sky, it's very bright. It's the brightest point of all. It's brighter than Jupiter, brighter than Mars. Venus is the brightest. But that's also the Luciferian quality of Venus, where Venus starts to compete with the sun. And it's the idea of when it runs amok, you would get narcissism, where you're looking in the mirror, another Venus-ruled thing, and you decide that you are superior to the light that you're receiving, and you want to cast your own light, in which case it would be a Venus that is running amok and will probably get you into trouble in terms of that, because of competing with the greater force. So those are some of the things that come up for me around Venus.
On the issue of that, I think you're thinking of Nick Dagan Best, who did a lot of work on Venus.
Yes,
who looked at it. Okay, so that's astrologer. So he's very much the special. You know how certain people just focus on. He knows a lot about that Venus cycle. And by the way, on the issue of Venus and Saturn, I think that may be the case. That's a really interesting point about consensus. Saturn is exalted in Venus, which is in Libra, which is a
Libra.
Venus ruled sign, right? So perhaps
Right.
that is the link to Saturn's particularly strong there. So maybe that's why you need it.
Yeah, yeah.
And on the narcissism, that's really interesting, because if you think of Venus, if you think of how it's represented in the fairy tales, how is Venus represented? That the wicked witch looking in the wicked stepmother looking into the mirror and being jealous of her stepdaughter and making sure that she tries to get rid of her, right? It's because the light must always only shine on me. And that is the reflection of this narcissistic thing. Now, what's interesting about that is Venus, along with the moon, are the two big feminine markers in the chart. The moon is very different. The moon likes, it's tribal. It likes to connect. It likes to nurture. Venus, I think what's really cool about it is Venus is an energy of differentiation. It needs to know that I am the one, right? In some way, it's very much, it used to rule the temple prostitutes, for example, in ancient, and why? Because they were reenacting a myth that would allow for fertility. And when we talk about fertility, they're really talking about the crops coming back and not starving. So it was a very important part of that whole cycle. But the thing about Venus in the Greek story, and actually also in the earlier incarnations in the Mesopotamian and the Sumerian, she decides, she picks. So she is married to Hephaestus in the Greek, who is the smith of the gods, but she's cheating on him all the time, especially with Mars. She is always wanting to go with Mars, to have a love affair with him. So the idea is her choice. It is her. She is not subject to anybody else's whims. And I think this is where it might connect to values and to the idea that a lot to do with Venus is, what are your values? And I think here it's just a proposition. I think Liz Green talked about this ages ago, that the reason you fall, the reason that love affairs are really important at the end of the day is they tell you a lot about what you find valuable. And that may be the only way you know, right? Because you're projecting all of your stuff onto some person. You think, oh, that person is this and this. It's really you, right? Because everything's projection. So you're projecting and you think, oh, that's what I really value. So some people may really value the intellect, some may value beauty, whatever, right? So it's actually a gateway to understanding yourself in a really big way, because it is fundamentally relational. You have to relate to others. No?
It's true. Yeah, it's true. It's true. And well, first of all, Venus, if it rules Libra, it's going to be relational, because that's the seventh house. It's the place where you marry. It's the place of the other, what you think it's beautiful. It's also, there's a link, I think, of Venus is what you like, what you find beautiful. So therefore, the aesthetics of it draw you. So then, in a way, you build your values around that. You decide, well, this is what's important to me. And although some of it, if you link it to Taurus, then there would be a security orientation around it as well, though. So it's not just beauty, but there's a bit of both. But definitely the beauty is important, because one thing I noticed as an example is people that have Moon Venus opposite or square in their chart, conjunct too, but some dynamic thing between Moon and Venus, they often go toward things like home decorating or aesthetics around the home because of the moon.
Right.
And Venus is that sense that it's your sense of aesthetics, what feels balanced to you and what feels like it's the right colors and things like that. Right. And so that it reveals itself through that as well, even though that's an external subject, but it reveals the nature of the planet, let's say, right? How it works.
Yeah, no, I there's thinking about also the value system. Values are so important, because once, of course, I'm coming always from the Jungian worldview, because that's what fascinates me. One of the things people have tremendous problems with in life is differentiation. And that's, by the way, a Mars thing, because you need a sword to differentiate, and that belongs to Mars. So Venus without Mars is a bit problematic. It should just merge with anything and connect to anything and not understand what she really needs. But once you bring in the sword and you bring in, okay, no, this is what I need, not that, then you start connecting to your more fundamental parts of yourself. And I think discernment is such a big word that most people don't get. What happens is everything can be a glob in the sense that you don't know how to take what you need from whatever particular part of life. So that's why I think the polarity is really important as well. And I think you're right about Venus in Taurus and Venus in Libra. They're two very different things. I do think that you have to look at the elements there. So for me, the Venus in Taurus, by being an earth sign, the earth is material form is security oriented, because it's all about connecting to the earth. Whereas Libra is very much about the air, spirit, masculine. I want to rise. I don't really care about what the earth is. I want to connect to something greater. And it's an air sign. So it's going to be done through communication or through connecting on a different way. But I think you can't get away from Taurus being, associated with food and all the things that give you comfort, because food keeps you safe, right? Too. I mean, in fact, a lot of people with Venus, the food becomes very important. They're great cooks. They need to feed others, because I know it's also involved with the moon, but it definitely has that element as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and that you can begin to see the potential downside of the archetype, or it can get you in trouble, in that Venus through in Taurus, it's the senses, literally the earth connection is your senses inform you, but then you can become sensual and you can become overly sensual. So then you could live for food, for example, because that's constantly stimulating the senses, or any other way in which you overplay the archetype. And just the whole notion that Venus, it is overall a soft symbol in the idea of seeking comfort, seeking pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. So this is good, and you have to be asking, okay, well, how is that working in my life? Is it am I really enjoying things, or is it costing me something, to indulge in the pleasure? So it's not in that sense. Even though Saturn is exalted in Libra, I don't see Venus by itself being inclined to do Saturnian things unless you have it linked to Saturn in the chart or some other thing. It's not its nature, as I understand.
But it's interesting bringing up the exaltation, because in Taurus, the moon is exalted. And I think the Venus and the moon are much more connected as archetypes in Taurus than they are in Libra. I do not see the moon Libra, with the significations being at all attached to Libra. The other thing I was thinking was how important the apple is to the stories connected to Venus, because you've got Adam and Eve, and of course Eve has to take a bite of the golden apple to get out of paradise so they can start having a life, because in paradise nothing changes. It's just no story. You need to break a rule. So she's actually the rule breaker. No, it's true. I mean, what are you going to do in paradise? She's just sitting around.
By the way, why is she blamed for that? I mean, that story.
Well, because she did. Well, actually, you should look at it differently, because if you think about it, it's a little bit like Pandora's box. Why are the women always opening the boxes? Because the curiosity, which is associated with cats, and cats in some symbolic systems are actually very Taurian, right? Because they're very sensual. They have that kind of Taurus vibe. But anyway, the idea is that the reason that Eve is taking a bite of the apple, right, is that someone has to take that first step into out of paradise so that you can develop consciousness, right? So in a way, she furthers the story along. It's then she gives it to the hapless Adam, who does whatever she says, and off they go. But prior to that, what do you have? You have no story. You have two people sitting there unconscious, not even aware they're naked, basically doing nothing. And then all of a sudden the story begins, and then everything becomes differentiated, which is what you're doing with consciousness. But with the apples, beyond that story, it actually is involved in one of the most famous and important stories that starts off the Western tradition. We've talked about it before in other places, and that's, of course, the big contest that happens when the Trojan. Okay, so the most important thing that happens in a mythological way is the Trojan War. Why is it important? Because the first written texts we have, or the first oral texts that then get converted to written texts, are Homer's, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in the Iliad, what starts this whole story off is that Paris, this young 17-year-old, is told you have to choose between three goddesses. One of them is Aphrodite, and you have to give the apple to the fairest. Now, isn't that amazing? It shows up in all sorts of fairy tales, right? To the fairest. So he's got to pick between Hera, Athena, and they're all offering him bribes, right? But Athena, of course, he's 17. What is Athena? I mean, Athena comes forth and says,
wisdom. I don't want wisdom.
Yeah, I don't want wisdom. And I don't want Hera. I don't want power. I want, so that Aphrodite steps up and says, I'm going to give you the most beautiful woman in the world. And he says, yeah, okay, fine. At first, he tries to dodge, by the way. Paris is aware that whatever he chooses, he's in big trouble. But, he hears Helen can be his. Helen is married to someone else. Therefore, we have the Trojan War. So once again, you have the apple coming in as the thing that you have to, it's like a representation of choice. And interesting enough, Isabel, I think is her name. There was a California, I think she was a Stanford. She did a whole thing on how important the apple was and the snake was to the development of vision. That the fact is that humans have fantastic vision, and it's because I think the only things that have better vision are birds of prey, right? And one of the things that helped us is we had to identify snakes, right? Or we'd be killed. So we evolved to the people who could identify snakes could have descendants because they survived. And the other thing is the apples are associated with ripe fruit. And the importance of ripe fruit is when you eat it in the fall, that's when everything, matures. You can eat it. It has more sugar, and it could keep you going through the winter. when food is scarce. So the fact is, we kind of evolved to be able to see. That's why, her point is, that's why in ads they always have a woman dressed in a red dress or a red car. You're actually priming the senses in a way to that have been encoded in our brains since we began our evolutionary journey. So it's really, really fascinating. But again, it's about that these themes keep coming up. Now let's talk about the Venus in Libra, because yes, it's balanced, it's beautiful. I think of Athens and I think of architecture. I think of beautiful glorious statues. But the common thing that everybody laughs about Libra is they can't make a decision, because it's so balanced that they're sort of, oh, maybe this, maybe that, maybe the other thing. And so they never go forward, which is kind of interesting, which is very different again from the Venus in Taurus. I think the Venus in Taurus knows how to make a decision because it's all survival based. So I will make a decision. But I think it's interesting that once you get to such a balanced, airy thing, you get kind of, and this is why I brought up the apple, that I think the apple points to fundamental part of the story. You must make a choice, even though it's going to get you into hot water, even though you're starting the Trojan War and it's going to be huge, you still have to make the choice. And I always think of Libra and that conundrum, in that, the story goes that Venus cannot, that it's search for balance. And I remember actually this I have a friend who has a child who has a lot of Libra planets. And when he was 6, we have the elections. We had an election here. I can't remember which election. And the mother put out her sign with her party. And he got really upset because he said, no, we have to have a sign for each of the parties. And he made her put a sign for each of the parties because it offended his sense of fair play. You just can't have one. You have to have the whole thing. But again, that's an example of not making, it's a silly example, but it's an example of not being able to make a decision. So I don't know what you think about that, but I thought of the apple. I thought, yeah, this is giving you a clue.
It's fascinating in that that's totally true about Libra. And yet it's curious that Libra is the cardinal sign, which is action oriented, and Taurus is the fixed sign, which isn't. Yeah. And yet
interesting.
From a more survival or practical maybe point of view, the Taurus in that sense may see it more clearly, and the Libra will get caught by the being too aware of both sides and what I can win, what I can lose, and things like that. So, but the other thing that's curious is the way you're telling it, and I hadn't made that connection before, because that's the Eris myth. So that really does connect Eris to Venus. Well, in part because she's the one that won the contest, at least in the way they tell it there. I have a feeling that the hidden meaning of that is that there are 3 impulses in the psyche, and you have to balance all 3. You can't just pick one and ignore the other 2, because then your life will be out of balance, which even though, Venus is trying to find balance, but going off on only a pleasure tangent, overt beauty, and you neglect Pallas Athena, which is wisdom, and Juno, which is your progress in life in the sense of where you are in society. Well, how far is that going to take you? But it's totally true what you said, that you give that question to someone, I don't know, under 30, some age where there's no way they're going to pick.
Wisdom at 17? No,
there's no way, unless they're incredibly wise, which forget it. It's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen.
So, but it's curious that may be another indicator of the Eris connection to Venus, and the potential that planet may be kind of like how Pluto is associated with Scorpio.
Right. In the modern sense,
associated with Libra. Kind of makes sense too, because then you get now I'm not clear on you get the connection to Athena, but in the warriorship, how do you resolve that? The fact, is it through the polarity of Mars, or how do you resolve?
For me, when I think of Athena fully formed, Athena in the Odyssey is bright-eyed Athena. She's guiding Odysseus. It's a wisdom thing, and that's why she comes out of Zeus's head. She comes fully armed because I think the idea is that you're at a time, if you look at it in the way that as an evolution of our consciousness, she's, as a figure mythologically, she's coming at a time when our consciousness is changing to a more intellectual, airy consciousness. So she's armed. What do we do with words? What do we do with the air? We actually slice things, right? We differentiate things, which I don't think Taurus does. Taurus is the earth. It's all a big mouth. But when you think of the Venus in air, you think of a very intellectual kind of Venus, right? And so it's a very different energy. That's why I think and in the myths, the biggest story we have with Venus is the Odyssey. She is the wise counsel. She is the one that counsels and very much. And the thing about the Odyssey is it presents man in a very different way from what we had before. What is valued in the Odyssey and about Odysseus is his cunning. Cunning is something that is air. It's not, it's not like he can plant great crops, or it is really about, can I outsmart somebody? And cunning is what you use for that. So I think that's the connection. And in terms of Uranus, I mean, Uranus starts the whole thing by throwing the apple on the table. So she's definitely connected to that whole story. There is no story. She's kind of like the rule breaker, just like what Eve does, in the sense that without that first bite of the apple, without you throwing an apple and forcing someone to make a decision. And it's really interesting, because encoded in that myth, you just said that as well, is the idea that when you make a choice, you're excluding other things, and they will come to haunt you, because you can never really live exclusively from one angle, right? You have to be able to include the whole. And one of the things that's really interesting is about Venus is that there's a quote by Plato that says, all love is the pursuit of the whole, right? And Venus being love, all love is the pursuit of the whole. Then the idea is you have to incorporate everything. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to be a Venus beauty person, but I'm going to, as you say, avoid, but you have to have wisdom, and you have to have practical common sense. And there's a whole bunch of things that you have to bring in. But what we do as humans, and this is where the differentiation of values, and why Venus is also very much tied to the word value. What do we value? Is we do make those choices all the time. And every time we do, the choice that we don't make, and that's the whole point of that story, comes back to bite us in some way or another. It will get us, right? And so the idea is you're always juggling this. You can't not make a choice. Sometimes you have to make choices, but the idea is you have to be able to be aware about what is unconsciously driving us when you do make that choice. And that's, I think, what gets really difficult, right?
Right. Although the thing would be, though, I mean, if you take that argument too far to the limit, and you keep, extrapolating, then pretty soon you're really caught on Libra, because you won't want to make the choice, because you'll think, oh my God, as soon as I make the choice, it's going to haunt me. So in a way, it's knowing, maybe through the connection to Taurus, where you say, well, what do I really value more, or what is more important to me, even though I may lose out on some aspect? Because I mean, when it comes to, say, overdoing Aphrodite, if you're overdoing pleasure, the other two archetypes suffer. So then you have to give it a certain amount, but not too much.
Exactly.
And so then you're pursuing the greater value, let's say, right?
Right.
What is more valuable for you, probably short and long term, but especially long term. How things will shake out. So yeah.
Well, I mean, again, we go back to the word balance, though, right? When you go into a psychotherapeutic setting, what you're trying to do, like Jung had the idea that when you get a bad dream, it's a compensatory. Any dream is a compensatory dream, and that it is trying to balance out a conscious attitude that you have in daily life that may not be working for you. So it's giving you the other side of the story. So you go, wait, I maybe, and that only happens where you're so imbalanced that you need to be brought back to the center. So the people in the East, they will meditate their way back, and maybe that will work. But the idea of depth psychology is you're always trying to balance yourself out, and your own psyche is giving you clues, whether you want to listen to or not. And I'm aware that half the world thinks dreams are just the detritus of everyday life. Okay, fine. But having watched my dreams, it is very true. It's just trying to bring you back to the center, because an unbalanced psyche creates a lot of anxiety, creates probably problems for others, because you start blaming others so the whole idea is to bring you back to that. And I think Venus is a really good, and I think relationship, which is associated with Venus, is so important, because that's where you're really testing yourself, right? That's where you really get tested. I thought it was funny that if you read Davis Zaval's book about the planets, when they finally figured out what planet, what Venus is composed of, it's sulfuric mess. It's hot as hell. You die within 2 seconds. I think they tried to land a probe in the 70s, and it basically got eaten up by the sulfur. So it's just this horrific, hot as hell place. And that you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because that is where the kind of places that you're taken to in bad relationships, right? Where you're basically, you're in a fire of your own desire, and then you can end up it can create a situation for you where your sense of self is gone, right? Because you cannot handle your own emotions. And that actually brings me to the other association with Venus is also is associated where you have the potential for creative talent. I think it's funny that in Taurus, for example, we always know that the Libra Venus is the art and the balance and whatever. But it's interesting to me that Venus in Taurus rules the throat, and you have so many great singers, for example, that have Taurus, major Taurus placements. Yes. Like just thinking off the top of my head, Streisand, Adele, all these really big voices, right? That just come at you. And so it's another form of expression, not quite the same thing, but it's about talent, right? And so the word talent is actually related to an old English word for money or coin. And it's interesting
Yes.
because I think the money is associated with Taurus as well, right?
Yes,
It has some bit bigger. Okay.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's actually right there. That I've mentioned that multiple times in classes and, across the years, that talent, the biblical talent is an actual money exchange
Right.
token coin, right? But now they're associated with skills and abilities. So the second sign in your chart and Taurus, because it's the natural second sign, and your talents are definitely Venusian. These are areas where, like Jupiter in a way, Jupiter and Venus are kind of in the same range around being benefics and being born with something that is natural to you, that you like, and then that you can further develop and get good at. And so then those are your talents, and then they could be the things that bring you actual talents, as in the form of money or security,
right.
Through expressing them. So yeah, that's absolutely true. Now, the only thing with what you said about the astronomy, the only problem with that is that if you push that and you try to create a paradigm, you start to get contradictions, things that don't make any sense. Like, for example, Venus, you're totally right. It's a scorching, really hot. It's hotter than an oven. I mean, you couldn't be there. So it's to getting as closer to the sun, it makes sense. And it has this feeling, well, yeah, that's what happens. If you indulge, if you get into Venus relationships, things can get really hot in a positive and in a negative way.
Yeah.
But then you think, well, then that should also apply to Mars. And it does, from Mars being red, but Mars is actually very cold. And Mars can get hotter than Venus around anger and, temperament, heat. Mars is notorious for that, like the idea of catching fevers and things like that.
Yeah.
And connecting to Mars. And then if you even go from even more, disparate, broken, illustrations, Saturn is this, place filled with methane. Is extremely cold out there. But Saturn, you'd think of not being a gas because it's a very solidity.
Solid.
It rules rocks and solid things and ice, but not water. And yet it's a gas, right? So
yeah. Well, I'm not making a connection in a literal way. I just think it's interesting that it's the sulfuric kind of hot place. That's all. And by the way, that it sounds a little bit like hell. And you just talked about Lucifer and his connection to it. So that's all. I mean, it's just a nice coincidence. It won't happen all the time, right? But it's a nice coincidence.
Like, quite honestly, Lucifer, I mean, to me, if you want to think of the really potential dangerous downside of Venus, if a person indulges that, like really gets into it and becomes captive and addicted to it, it is a form of hell, because you're like a hungry ghost. You can never fulfill it properly. In fact, you could even argue that in some way it's the literal definition of addiction, where you're caught by something that is impossible to fulfill, right? But the pleasure keeps drawing you in and it never ends. And then in a sense, you're in hell, because that's what that would be.
And I think that's probably, in a birth chart, the way I've seen it play out is if it's making contact with an outer planet like Pluto or Uranus or Neptune, suddenly you've got a dissolution in the case of Neptune, or an obsession in case of Pluto. And it'll drag you into the underworld very, very quickly. Of course, Lucifer was the favorite angel of God who gets relegated. So it's kind of an interesting set, because it's bringer of light. So it's the idea, of course, it would be associated with Venus, who is the brightest thing, but it's basically an angel in exile, right? Because if we go back to the idea of Venus as translating the light of the sun or helping the journey of the sun, then they need each other, right? In a certain way. So there's no out. Now, I thought also about the exaltation of Venus in Pisces, because in the modern way of looking at Neptune is the co-ruler of Pisces. In the modern, the more Hellenistic astrologers stick with Jupiter only. But I thought of Neptune as being, if you think of the archetype, Neptune is like a higher octave that we often talk about. It's often said it's a higher octave of Venus. And I think actually it's really good to look at Pisces and Venus's exaltation in Pisces, in that Venus generally will choose, right? So you just don't have 5 people you're in love with. Most people have maybe one, that they're at a time, at least, you hope, right?
Unless Venus is opposing something, right?
So you might have more than one, and that's fine. But I mean, at a certain degree, you're not going to be feeling that kind of intense emotion for 1,000 people. But in Neptune, I always think of Pisces as the ability to feel compassion on a higher level for humanity, for the other, instead of going around. And so I think it's interesting that Venus is exalted in Pisces, because I think what it's pointing to is the possibility of a higher love that transcends that choice. And because in Pisces, nobody makes a choice, right? Because you're merging with the world all the time, right? It's the dream world. So it's interesting that it would be exalted there. where you would think, well, wait a minute, Venus has to make, it's about values. So why the heck? And I think it's because it's expressing a side of Venus that cannot be expressed in either Taurus or in Libra, and that it has a greater concern for the whole. And so I think that's the only way I can make sense of it. I don't know how you thought about that one.
Yeah, that's correct. You said it perfectly. The Pisces, I mean, the higher octave, Neptune is the higher octave of Venus. That I definitely subscribe to. It's like the personal love and the more cosmic or unified, bigger picture love energy. I even mentioned today in class about how Jung's Neptune Sun square, he was focused on that greater inclusivity, the numinous overarching reality, and he's trying to figure that out because he's got a Neptune Sun square. So it's like a really big Venus in a way, a really big love principle.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Now, the thing with this, though, is you always in astrology, as I understand it, or in the archetypes, for sure, is the two sides. So then, because you could say, well, okay, look, Venus and Pisces, exalted. Sure. But I bet you that if you collect charts, you'll run into a chart. And I can't say that I have. This just came to me, but I bet if I look long enough, I'll find it. Where even with Venus and Pisces, because Pisces, the other side of Pisces is, well, you love everybody, right?
Yeah.
Right. So then you could get even a prostitute or someone who is loving too much because they've decided, well, I'm not going to make any difference. It'll just, and it works for me, by the way, because it's in my second house and I make money.
Oh yeah,
or whatever, right?
Connected, yes. There's no way, but I mean, everything has a shadow side, right? So we're talking about, when you talk about archetypal principles, they're very complex. So we're giving sort of an overview, right? So of course, and Venus and Pisces can like anything. And then you don't even need Venus and Pisces. All you need is Venus in contact with Neptune.
Yes,
you've got the same story working out, right? And then whatever house it falls, it will tell you a little bit part of the story. To Jung, to the point of, bringing up Jung with his Saturn Neptune square, and which is interesting. I mean, Sun Neptune square. Sun Neptune. It's in Leo, so you would expect one of his principles is the principle of individuation, which is not about being selfish. It's about developing the whole self. But what's interesting about him is he was looked down upon by the medical community for being a mystic, and that's a word I associate with that kind of Venus and Pisces quality with Neptune in it, right? The idea that what you're trying to do is merge. You're trying to find a way to, it's not really about the other person. It's about the idea that you are one in some way with the whole world, with the universe, right? And so this is, I think, when you're seeing people like that, they cannot help but try to address that need in themselves. And I just think that I've known people that have that, and I see that there's a constant need to find a way to express that energy in a way that connects them to, and of course that can lead to addiction, because as we know, sometimes the only way you can connect is by dissolving the self, by drinking too much or taking drugs or whatever. It's a dicey, and it's a really important thing to say that every archetype has its shadow side. And so, too much Venus means too much sugar, because Venus also rules sugar to some degree, and Jupiter as well. So it's one of those things where any benefic can become a malefic if you overdo it, right? And there's a tendency to do it. But I think at the end of the day, Venus in the traditional systems of joys in the fifth, and that makes sense to me, because the fifth house is play, creativity, children. Venus would be happy there, right? Because Venus is about enjoyment and pleasure. She's not going to join the eighth, where the darkness is. And so I think to myself, okay, what brings you pleasure? And for everybody, that's very different. Some people are obsessed. I always find what people are obsessed with really fascinating to me. Some person will be obsessed with, collecting one thing, and then you think, why? And that is so personal. That's what makes the person. But again, overdone, if you're just focused to the exclusion of all else. Yeah, but that's any archetype, right? You've got to find the balance. And by the way, I mean, it's inscribed in their story. You need to find balance, especially with Venus, because Venus is the one place that can take you to some pretty dark places. And that's why I brought up the original myth of Inanna and Ishtar. I have a feeling in the Greek pantheon, she got scrubbed. She got like, oh, let's just make her beautiful. But the fact is, the original story tells you that she went down, and this speaks to Venus exalted in Pisces. She went down out of compassion for her sister. She decided to take the underworld journey, to go in there. And so you can't leave that part of the story out. But what we've done is we've sanitized Venus. Now she's just beauty and she's whatever. But no, there is a dark side. And the dark side is often that you have to go to places that are very uncomfortable. I think of Pema Chodron's book, always The Places That Scare You, it's one of the books that she wrote. And it's just about that really what you're doing is you're always trying to face those places, because if not, they own you, right? So the idea is to become comfortable with what is fundamentally uncomfortable, and going into the underworld, whether you're saving your sister or not, and hanging upside down on a meat hook for 3 days. It's like until you're uncomfortable. Do you notice how this keeps showing up? I always think it's funny that people go, oh, the archetypal stuff, that's just invented stuff. And you think, do you not get that these same themes keep showing up in all the stories? It doesn't matter if they're Sumerian or whatever. Why? Because they're powerful, because we relate to them, right? Down to the fact that our fairy tales and, Disney is still working with, the seven dwarfs. And, you have why the seven dwarfs? Well, because there are seven planets, traditional planets. And that's, it's just so interesting to me that you do, people don't see this. But maybe, I'm also a storyteller. It could be that I'm seeing too much in the world too. I'm well aware of it. Yeah. So if someone were to talk to you about, okay, if somebody came to you and said, I have, you're well aware that they have a Venus problem. What's the antidote? What would you say to a person who is overdoing their Venus? What do they do? What do they draw?
Well, it's curious that you said something that lines up with a class I just did, where I said that in Leo, there is nothing exalted, but I forgot that Venus is in its joy in Leo, right?
Yeah. Well, it's enjoying the fifth. So if you're using
the fifth. Yeah, okay, yeah. Right. So Leo is the fifth, the natural fifth sign, right?
Yes.
So,
and then one, yeah.
But that's really interesting, because the idea then it makes Venus a creative force, because the fifth is the place of children. It's where things get created, manifested, brought into the world. They exist through the fifth, literally. So then that connects it to the solar energy. You might even bring in the potential it's going to compete and get Luciferian as a result of that, because really it's the sun, but the Venus wants a piece of that.
Right.
And what's curious is you mentioned before about the pentagrams. And the thing about the pentagram, number one, that pentagrams are 5, and that's the fifth sign, right?
Right.
5 is very connected in the numerology of astrology to a very creative harmonic. The fifth sign is where you create something that is uniquely yours, which again, that can take it into the Luciferian side a little too easily, but it's a creative energy in the end, right? Mm-hmm. And so then the pentagram, you notice that in a sense, that's great because you're creating something, but the pentagram is also associated with devilish activity, the idea of satanic, when they're doing satanic rituals, you see pentagrams everywhere. Yeah. So that would be the bad side of that, right? So when you said, well, what does a person do if there's too much Venus, you just look at the core meanings and you ask yourself, okay, am I doing this in a way that is bringing me balance, or is this bringing me imbalance?
Right.
And that you have to be self-aware enough to know the difference. And typically, all I can say is you get better with age, because when you're younger, you sometimes will think you're in balance and then you're completely out of balance. And a decade later, you realize, oh my God, I've been, constantly throwing myself out of balance because I really like this. And I kept rationalizing that what I like is the way it should be. Right. When maybe I just like it too much and I should like it a little less so that I can gain balance. So it becomes a self-awareness things. And you could say the secret is to refine your values, which is like, what do you think is important? Refine it. I mean, to me, refinement, essentializing something, there might be an archetype for that as well. I bet there is. And by the way, it's curious that what is around essentializing this magical word that is out there, quintessential, which is 5 again, right? 5, the power of 5 and how that goes to the fifth sign, creativity and so forth. So long answer.
No, that's a great thing. I want to give you a counter to the satanic pentagram business and why it might have been used. There at some point, let's just consider this story. What do you think of this? At some point, the feminine became demonized, right? Because the feminine was in exile. And the pentagram is always associated with feminine, right? With Venus, as we said. When they were going to burn witches in the time, the big witch hunt craze of 12th century, 13th century, they would draw a pentagram on the house of the witch that they had labeled, the woman they had labeled as a witch. So to me, that has always been a literalization of the fear of the feminine. So you take a woman out and you burn her, right? Because so to me, it's not in that case, you've taken the pentagram, which is something associated with beauty, but women can scare men. I was just talking about this actually today with my son about how if you disown your feelings, you will project it and start getting scared of women, right? And that was literally what was happening in the Middle Ages, and then and well beyond that, by the way, because it was happening for a long time. So, and one of the things I connect to this is that one of the original myths we have, which has nothing to do with Venus, but just comes to me right now, is the idea of stealing fire from the gods. And stealing fire is a creative act, by the way, which is a fifth house kind of thing, right? You steal fire so you can create something really beautiful, but you're stealing a little bit of God. And so the idea is that you're going to be punished because what you've just done, just like Prometheus did, and then had his liver pecked out every night, was you've taken something that does not belong to you, that belongs up there. And so there is a price to pay. And by the way, it's often been said that the creative journey exacts a price from the person who is creative. They just don't go out there. And done well, it can be harrowing, right? So to me, the pentagram is really interesting because it has been taken and turned into a satanic symbol, and a symbol of, well, we have to persecute this. But what they're persecuting is their own inner feminine that they can't live with. And so if you look at the history of that, it's amazing what we can do with symbolism, right? You can take something that the ancients had seen in the sky and revered, and then you suddenly inscribe it on a wall and burn the person who you decide is representing it. And so it's frightening to me, as a symbolic, and how it also shows me how powerful symbolism is, that we think it's not. Just think of a cross. How powerful is that? I mean, entire groups will go to war over a symbol, right? So that's to me, that's what came up. I'd forgotten all about the horrible history of that particular symbol, but it definitely does apply there. So finishing up, I would like to say with this. Oh, go ahead, say something.
No, just really quickly that I can tell you for a fact from studying it in my own chart, because I've seen it in the charts of others. It's clear there too, but it's always going to be more clear when I'm experiencing it directly. Sure. The fifth harmonic, like the idea of the pentagram, when you divide the circle in 5 pieces and you get planets at any of those points, such that, for example, say your sun or whatever it is somewhere, and then a planet aspects that sun in its transit in a fifth harmonic, or some other thing that you see in the chart through progression, or even like, for example, if a planet is, instead of being a fifth is 72 degrees, but let's say that it was 70 degrees, and you see it growing towards 72, that's a developing thing. Point being that it definitely is a creative aspect. It's actually benign. There's no problem whatsoever. The only thing that is dangerous about it is that you can create a style, a way of doing something, a creation of yours that is actually harmful to other people, right? In some matter. And the example of this, by the way, someone that has a really, really intense fifth harmonic alignment to his ascendant descendant is Trump. Trump has
that's
really
so
intense.
Surprising.
Isn't that amazing? That he creates the style of relating that is totally self-serving to,
right.
So anyways.
That's a good example. That's exactly what you see that. Yes. Let's finish with this. Aphrodite has a son called Cupid. Cupid. And so Cupid's going around shooting arrows in people's butts and making them fall in love with the wrong people. And I just want to finish with that because I think it's a great story. And there's a great story, Cupid and Psyche, where Psyche falls in love with Cupid, and she has to she's put through the ringer by Aphrodite. And actually, this original story then gives birth to so many fairy tales. When you have this woman going through this process of trying to differentiate and discern, because that's what's so hard for the feminine psyche. But I think it's interesting that you get hit with an arrow, and that this is the descendant of, because that's what happens when you're struck with Venus, right? That this could be the negative, but at the same time positive, because if you don't do that, you don't learn about yourself. So the idea is you need to be from time to time, and an arrow does not have to be just in a love affair. It could be by you suddenly become obsessed with attaining a certain value or a certain talent or whatever it is. You need to have a bit of that Cupid kind of obsession to be able to develop your talent, to develop. So it's kind of a nice interworking, or it's a kind of nice descendant of that story. The fact that Cupid is involved in all of this, and that it is this cherubic angel going around creating problems everywhere.
Isn't Cupid, though, I mean, that an arrow you associate to Mars. So that's the Mars.
Yes.
It's a pointy thing that,
wakes you up.
So that's the polarity. Yeah. And you can even, because you've used the word obsession quite a bit.
Yeah.
That would be the idea, Venus Mars. If you do Venus Mars, you always go to like the polarity of Taurus, Scorpio, Aries, Libra. Right. But in Scorpio, definitely you're going to get an obsession for sure. An over merging, an over concern with something. But as you say, that's part of the deal, because without it, you can't progress. I mean, there's so many things in these myths and in astrology, all these catch-22s where you can't live with it and you can't live without it. It's necessary to bring it in, even though, you may think, well, I don't want to be on a Saturn transit. And then the answer is, well, then you're not going to get any work done.
No, that's it. You're just going to sit around. Well, I mean, I would leave with people with this, that the reason I think they're valuable is that the difference is, are you doing this consciously or are you doing this unconsciously?
Correct.
Most people do this unconsciously and create enormous problems for themselves. So the idea is you have a choice to become conscious. It doesn't make the journey any easier. I'm not saying that you suddenly don't feel the arrow that's just been hit on the side of your body, but what it makes you understand is, okay, here, this is happening for a reason. And I think that the Hellenistic astrologers developed their astrology, I've said this before, as a way to understand fate. Right. And so there are certain things you can't stop from happening, but at least you can have some sort of philosophy that allows you to understand, okay, this may be in service. And I think that's what a lot of Eastern teachers have taught us. This may be in service of a higher goal that I'm not aware of yet. Right. And so I have to live with it and I have to suffer the consequences. I have to sit in the fire. And it is, again, I think of Venus and fiery. You got to sit in it. And you got to let it stew, and eventually, hopefully, something will be transformed because fire does transform you. And it's interesting that Venus is not exalted in any fire sign. Venus has nothing to do with fire, and yet there is an element of having, you must actually go through this. You must go through this. And that's why I like the Nana and the Ishtar myths, because it tells you by going to the underworld, this is where you are hung upside down, and this with time hopefully allows for some sort of resolution. Okay, well, we'll leave it with that wonderful metaphor. See
leave it there. All right. So
okay.
we're on to, is it Mars next, or is it
Mars is next? Then we give
right.
the antidote, which will of course bring in the very polarity again that we're talking about, but at least people will be aware of it already. So
all right. I look forward to that.
Next time. Yep.
All right.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to hear more about all of this, go to YouTube, where you will find Andre's channel called Astrology Alert. He posts videos there almost daily. He also teaches classes through his Patreon account. You can find me at sophiapsychos.com. If you want to support my work, I've recently released a new novel called Invocation, which you may find of interest. Go to my website to see a book trailer about it. It's available in all fine bookstores, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Finally, if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review so that others will find it as well.